Imagine standing at the very edge of time, peering into the earliest days of human existence, a world that is no longer the paradise of Eden, but a harsh, untamed land filled with struggle, survival, and the weight of an unimaginable tragedy. In this world, two brothers, Cain and Abel, walk very different paths. Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, works the soil, sweating under the sun, coaxing life from the ground. Abel, his younger brother, watches over the flocks, tending to creatures that roam freely across the land. Their lives are deeply intertwined, yet fate has set them on a collision course that will change the course of history. The moment comes when both brothers bring an offering to the Lord. Abel, with a heart devoted to God, offers the firstborn of his flock, a sacrifice that is both costly and sincere. Cain, on the other hand, brings some of the fruits of the soil, an offering that, though given, lacks the spirit of true devotion. As the smoke of Abel's sacrifice rises, accepted by God, Cain watches in growing bitterness, his own offering left unacknowledged. His face darkens, his heart twists with jealousy, and the seeds of something dangerous take root. God, in his wisdom, sees the storm brewing within Cain. He speaks, offering counsel, warning him, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Genesis 4:6-7. These words are not condemnation, but an invitation, an opportunity to choose differently, to master the anger that is growing within him. But Cain does not listen. In the quiet of the fields, away from the eyes of their parents, Cain calls Abel to him. Perhaps Abel does not suspect anything. Perhaps he still believes in his brother's love. But Cain, overcome by the rage that has now consumed him, strikes Abel down. The earth, which had once received Abel's offering, now drinks the blood of the innocent. It is the first murder recorded in human history, the first act of fratricide, and the first undeniable sign of how far humanity has fallen from grace. The voice of God breaks through the silence. "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain, still blinded by his own crime, responds with words that echo across history. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Genesis 4:9. It is not just a lie. It is defiance, an attempt to distance himself from what he has done. But God's voice is unwavering. "What have you done? Listen! Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Genesis 4:10. The judgment falls. Cain is cursed, banished from the land, doomed to wander. The very ground that once yielded crops under his hand will now resist him. He will be a fugitive, a restless wanderer upon the earth, a man marked by his own actions. But it is in Cain's response to this judgment that a great mystery arises. "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Genesis 4:13-14. Who is Cain afraid of? If Adam and Eve were the first humans, and if Abel is now dead, then who else could there be? Who are these mysterious others that Cain fears will seek vengeance upon him? This question has sparked centuries of debate among scholars, theologians, and historians alike. Some believe that Cain's fear was directed at his own future relatives, other children that Adam and Eve would later have, whose offspring would eventually fill the earth. Genesis 5:4 does mention that Adam had other sons and daughters, though they remain unnamed in the early accounts. If Cain knew that humanity was meant to multiply, his fear may have been a realization that Abel's future relatives would one day seek retribution for his crime. But there is another theory, one that suggests Cain was not alone in this world. Some have speculated that outside of the lineage of Adam and Eve, there may have been other human beings created by God, separate from the direct line of Eden. Could it be that Adam and Eve's story is one of representation rather than exclusivity? That while they were the first in the divine narrative, there were others living beyond the garden's borders, unknown to them. This perspective is unconventional, but it raises intriguing possibilities. Could Cain have encountered other tribes, other communities that God had placed in the world? If so, was his fear not just of his own family's revenge, but of unknown forces he would now be vulnerable to? And then there is the mark, the sign that God places upon Cain. Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. Genesis 4:15. This mark is one of the greatest mysteries of Scripture. What was it? Was it a physical sign, something visible to others? Or was it a divine protection, an unseen shield ensuring that Cain's life would not be taken, despite his crime? Some interpret this as an act of mercy, a reminder that even in judgment, God does not abandon his creation. Even the murderer is not beyond the reach of divine grace. But this act raises another question. Why protect Cain at all? The weight of what Cain has done cannot be ignored. He has taken an innocent life, defied God's warning, and now stands as an exile in a world that will never fully accept him. And yet God spares him. He does not erase Cain from existence. Instead, he allows him to live, to wander, to build, and to leave behind a legacy that will shape the future of humanity in ways yet to be seen. And so, Cain departs. The story does not end here. In the lands beyond Eden, Cain will build a city. He will father descendants who will leave their mark upon history. But the stain of his crime will follow him. His name will be remembered as the first to shed human blood, the first to reject God's warning, the first to experience exile from both his family and his Creator. But what about us? What do we take from this? Have you ever felt the burden of guilt, a weight so heavy that it seems impossible to bear? Have you ever feared the consequences of your own choices, knowing that what you've done cannot be undone? And in those moments, have you ever wondered, does God still care? The story of Cain is not just about judgment. It is about grace, even in exile. Cain bore the weight of his actions, but God still placed a mark of mercy upon him. Could it be that, even in our worst moments, God's grace still reaches out to us? If this story is making you reflect, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, we're going to uncover what happened to Cain after his exile, his journey, his descendants, and the city he built in the land of Nod. Stay with us, because what happens next may change how you see the early history of humanity forever. The weight of Cain's crime is unbearable. He can still hear his brother's voice, not in words, but in the silence of the fields where Abel's blood soaks into the earth, the silence that now fills the space where his brother once stood. The world feels emptier, and yet the consequences of his actions have only begun. Cain's punishment is severe. No longer will the soil yield its strength to him. The land that once provided for him will now resist him at every turn. But even more than that, he is condemned to wander, to live as an exile, a fugitive with no true home. His name is now synonymous with bloodshed, his past an open wound that cannot be healed. But what terrifies Cain most is not the curse itself. It is the realization that his life is no longer his own. Someone will find him, someone will recognize what he has done, and they will kill him. His voice trembles as he cries out to God, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Genesis 4:13-14. This is the moment where something unexpected happens. God, though just in his judgment, does not abandon Cain. Instead, he places a mark upon him, not as a curse, but as a shield, a warning to any who might seek to harm him. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Genesis 4:15. It is a strange paradox, a man condemned to roam, yet protected by the very hand of God, a murderer, yet not forsaken. The weight of his guilt remains, but so does the mark of divine protection. And so Cain departs, turning his back on everything he has ever known. His journey takes him eastward, into a land called Nod. The name itself means wandering, a fitting description for the fate he now bears. There are no walls to shelter him, no familiar faces to greet him. Every shadow feels like a threat. Every sound in the distance might be an enemy. He does not know what awaits him beyond Eden, but he has no choice except to move forward. And yet, despite the curse placed upon him, Cain refuses to live in perpetual exile. He makes a choice, a defiant choice. Instead of spending his days wandering aimlessly, he settles. Instead of accepting the role of an outcast, he builds. He establishes the first recorded city in the Bible, a place that should not exist, a place built by a man sentenced to roam, and he names it Enoch, after his son. It is an irony that cannot be ignored. A man cursed to be restless, now laying the foundation for permanence. A fugitive, now a founder. But how? How does a man sentenced to isolation manage to build an entire city? Who would have lived there? Where did these people come from? For centuries, this has been one of the greatest mysteries of Genesis. If Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel were the first humans, then where did the inhabitants of Enoch come from? Was Cain truly alone in the world when he left Eden, or did others already exist beyond the horizon? One possibility is that Adam and Eve had other children, sons and daughters who are not named in the early chapters of Genesis. Later in Genesis 5:4, we are told that Adam had many more children, though the details of their lives are left unrecorded. If these siblings and their descendants had begun to multiply, Cain may have encountered them as he traveled further east. But there is another theory, one that suggests Cain did not step into an empty world at all. Some scholars have proposed that other human beings existed beyond Eden, separate from the direct lineage of Adam and Eve. Could it be that the Bible focuses on the story of Adam and Eve while other groups of people lived elsewhere, forming early communities that Cain might have joined? While this idea is controversial, it raises fascinating questions. If there were other civilizations, then Cain's city may not have been built from nothing. It may have been a transformation of something that already existed. If these were people outside of Adam's direct lineage, did they know of God? Did they recognize Cain's crime? And if so, did they fear him? Regardless of how it happened, Cain does what seems impossible. He creates a legacy. His son, Enoch, carries his name forward. His city stands as proof that, even in the face of divine punishment, man still strives to create, to build, to establish something lasting. But can a foundation built on blood truly last? Cain's lineage, unlike the descendants of his younger brother Seth, does not walk in the ways of the Lord. Among his descendants is Lamech, a man who takes vengeance to an even greater extreme than Cain himself. In Genesis 4:23-24, Lamech boasts, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times." This declaration reveals something disturbing. Cain's curse did not end with him. The violence that began with Abel's murder continued through his descendants, growing even darker with each generation. Cain's city, though a place of refuge, becomes a symbol of something else, the enduring presence of sin in human civilization. A place that should represent new beginnings instead carries the stain of its founder's crime. And so, the city of Enoch stands as a paradox, a place of structure yet born from chaos, a monument to human resilience yet marked by the consequences of a single, fateful decision. Cain's story, though shrouded in mystery, forces us to ask, can we ever truly escape the consequences of our choices? Is it possible to build something meaningful when the foundation is rooted in guilt? And most importantly, what does God's protection over Cain teach us about mercy, even in the face of judgment? Cain should have been erased. His crime was unforgivable, and yet God allowed him to live. More than that, he allowed him to build. Why? Was it a punishment, forcing Cain to live with his actions? Or was it a second chance, a chance to create rather than destroy? Perhaps in Cain's story, we find something deeply personal. Have you ever felt like your past defines you? Like no matter what you do, the weight of your mistakes follows you? Cain's exile was his consequence, but it was not the end of his story. And maybe, just maybe, that means it's not the end of yours either. If this story has made you think, share your reflections in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, we'll explore how Cain's descendants shaped the world, and what this tells us about the ongoing struggle between sin and redemption. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what happens next. The sun sets over the city of Enoch, casting long shadows across its walls. It is a city that was never meant to be, a monument built by a man sentenced to wander. The streets are filled with life, but there is something unsettling beneath the surface. The weight of Cain's past has not faded with time. It lingers, shaping the generations that follow. Cain, the man who took his brother's life, was given a mark of protection. But what about his descendants? Did they inherit his curse, or did they carve out their own fate? The Bible does not tell us much about Cain's personal journey after he built his city, but it does give us a glimpse into the lives of his descendants. And what we find is troubling. Among them is Lamech, a man who does not merely follow in Cain's footsteps, but takes his legacy of violence to new heights. In Genesis 4:23-24, Lamech speaks to his wives Adah and Zillah, boasting, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Cain's crime was an act of anger, a moment of uncontrolled jealousy that led to murder. But Lamech, he speaks of murder as a right, as something he boasts about rather than regrets. He does not cry out in fear of judgment like Cain did. Instead, he claims a greater vengeance, a greater arrogance. This moment tells us something critical. Sin does not stay contained. It grows. Cain's choice to take his brother's life was not just a personal failing. It became a pattern, a path, a road that others would walk down long after he was gone. And this is where we come to a hard truth, one that stretches beyond Cain's bloodline and into the world we live in today. Sin does not remain in isolation. One act of violence breeds another. One moment of jealousy sparks another. One decision to turn away from God leads to a generation that no longer seeks him at all. Cain's descendants should have learned from his mistakes, but instead they amplified them, and yet God did not wipe them out. He allowed Cain's line to continue. He allowed civilization to grow. He allowed people to make choices, even when those choices led them further from him. Why let sin persist? Perhaps it is because God's plan has always been about redemption. Cain's story did not end with his crime, and neither did the story of his descendants. But it is in contrast to Cain's bloodline that we find the answer. Through Seth, Adam and Eve's other son. While Cain's family descended deeper into arrogance and violence, Seth's lineage took a different path. Genesis 4:26 tells us, "At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord." A new legacy was being written, one that sought God rather than turned away from him. And here is where we find the real message of Cain's story. The past does not have to define the future. Lamech may have taken Cain's darkness and multiplied it, but Seth's descendants found another way. The Bible shows us that no matter how broken a family's history might be, there is always a choice. There is always another path. Cain's city may have been built by a man cursed to wander, but it was not the end of God's story. His descendants may have embraced pride and vengeance, but God's mercy remained available. This is what the Bible shows us over and over again. Sin continues, but so does grace. Even today, we see the echoes of Cain's choices. We see violence, we see pride, we see people rejecting God. We see generations repeating the mistakes of those who came before them. But we also see hope. We see people turning back, choosing faith, breaking the cycle of sin. And that is where the true power of this story lies. Cain's legacy teaches us what happens when sin is left unchecked, but it also serves as a warning, a reminder that we do not have to follow in those footsteps. What about you? Have you ever felt trapped by the past? Have you ever seen the weight of generational mistakes playing out in your own life? Cain's descendants carried his burden, but they did not have to, and neither do we. There is always another way. And as we continue this journey through the stories of the Bible, we will see that God's mercy is greater than any curse, any sin, any past mistake. If this story has made you think, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, we'll explore the legacy of Seth and the promise of redemption that would one day change the course of history. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what happens next. The world had changed. The echoes of Abel's blood still cried out from the ground, and Cain had vanished into exile, marked and wandering. Adam and Eve, once the caretakers of Eden, now lived in a world marked by pain, loss, and separation from God. The weight of their past choices pressed down on them, and the empty space left by Abel's absence was a constant reminder of the brokenness that had entered creation. But then, something happened. A new life entered the world. Eve gave birth to another son, and she named him Seth. God has granted me another child in place of Abel since Cain killed him. Genesis 4:25. Seth was more than just another child. He was a symbol of restoration, a second chance, a new beginning. His birth was a declaration that God's plan had not been derailed by sin, that his promises would still stand, that the story was not over. Cain's descendants had begun to build their own civilization, a legacy marked by arrogance and violence. But Seth's birth set in motion a different path, one that would lead humanity back to God. For generations, the story of Cain and Abel had been one of tragedy, but Seth's story was one of hope, and through him something incredible happened. Genesis 4:26 tells us, "At that time people began to call on the name of the Lord." Something had shifted. A spiritual awakening was taking place. The line of Seth became a lineage of faith, a people who would seek after God rather than turn away from him. Unlike Cain's descendants, who boasted in their own strength, indulged in violence, and embraced vengeance, Seth's line was different. His family began to worship, to walk with God, to restore what had been lost. And among his descendants, we find names that shine like beacons of faith. Enoch, who walked so closely with God that he was taken up, never seeing death. Noah, who found favor in the eyes of the Lord when the world had descended into corruption. The legacy of Seth was one of faithfulness, and it stood in stark contrast to Cain's line. But here's what's truly powerful about this story. Seth was not born into perfection. He was born into a broken world, one that had already felt the sting of death and sin. His birth did not erase what had happened before, nor did it remove the consequences of the past. But it offered something new, a chance for humanity to realign with God, a chance to choose a different path. And isn't that exactly what God does in our own lives? We may have mistakes behind us. We may have brokenness in our families, pain in our history, consequences we cannot undo. But just as he did with Seth, God gives us a new beginning. Think about your own life. Have you ever wished you could start over? Have you ever felt the weight of past choices pressing down on you? The birth of Seth reminds us that God is always writing a greater story, one that doesn't ignore our failures, but instead offers redemption in the midst of them. And Seth's story doesn't just end with him. His lineage continues, growing into a people who walked with God, a people who would one day bring forth the greatest promise of all, Jesus Christ himself. From the ashes of Cain and Abel, from the pain of exile and death, came the bloodline that would one day lead to salvation for all of humanity. Seth was the beginning of that restoration. And what about us? Are we walking in the legacy of Cain, choosing our own way, rejecting God's presence? Or are we walking in the footsteps of Seth, calling on the name of the Lord, restoring what was lost? The choice is always before us. Cain's city was built on the foundation of human pride, but Seth's family was built on the foundation of faith. And the truth is, we are all part of one of those two stories. Which story will you be a part of? If this message has spoken to you, let us know in the comments. And if you're ready to explore how the legacy of Seth led to one of the greatest acts of faith in human history, stay with us. Because next, we'll dive into the story of a man who walked with God so closely he never saw death, the incredible life of Enoch. You won't want to miss it. The world was changing, and not for the better. The descendants of Cain had spread across the land, building cities, forging weapons, and boasting in their own strength. Violence was increasing, and humanity seemed to be moving further and further from God. But amidst the darkness, a different story was unfolding. A story of hope, of faith, and of a promise that would shape the future of all mankind. This story begins with Seth. His birth was more than just a continuation of Adam and Eve's family. It was a sign of restoration. When Abel was killed, it seemed as though righteousness had been extinguished. But through Seth, God was writing a new chapter. And through his descendants, he would establish a line of faithfulness, one that would ultimately bring about the greatest fulfillment of his plan. Genesis 4:26 tells us something remarkable. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This wasn't just about Seth, it was about a shift in humanity. While Cain's lineage pursued power, vengeance, and self-glorification, Seth's family chose a different path. They turned toward God, they worshipped, they walked in faith. And from this lineage, some of the most extraordinary figures in biblical history would emerge. One of them was Enoch. Unlike others in his time, Enoch lived in close communion with God. He didn't just acknowledge God's existence, he walked with him, every step of his life guided by faith. And because of this, something happened to Enoch that had never happened before. He never saw death. Genesis 5:24 tells us, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him away. This was a foreshadowing of something greater, a glimpse into the kind of relationship humanity was always meant to have with God. Enoch's life proved that faith could transcend death itself. Then, from the same lineage came another man, Noah. By Noah's time, the world had become utterly corrupt. Humanity had abandoned its purpose, turning to wickedness, selfishness, and destruction. But Noah found favor with God. Why? Because he was different. Because he still walked in the way of Seth. He still called on the name of the Lord. And so, in the midst of judgment, Noah was chosen to preserve life, to carry forward the promise that had begun with Seth. Do you see the pattern? Cain's descendants built a legacy of rebellion, but Seth's line carried a legacy of redemption. Cain's family grew powerful in the eyes of the world, but Seth's descendants grew powerful in the eyes of God. And this wasn't just about the past. Seth's lineage had a purpose, an ultimate mission, one that would not be fulfilled for many generations. Because from this line, through Noah, through Abraham, through David, would come Jesus Christ. This is where the story of Seth finds its greatest meaning. It wasn't just about one family. It wasn't just about one generation calling on the Lord. It was about the unfolding of a divine plan, a plan that would bring redemption not just to one group of people, but to the entire world. Through Seth's descendants, God was preparing the way for the Savior, the one who would do what Adam, Eve, Abel, and even Seth himself could not do: restore humanity's broken relationship with God. Think about this for a moment. It all began with a single choice. Seth and his descendants chose to seek God. They chose to remain faithful in a world that was turning away. And because of that, they became part of something much bigger than themselves. And isn't that the same choice we face today? Are we walking in the way of Cain, pursuing our own desires, our own power, our own ways? Or are we walking in the way of Seth, calling on the name of the Lord, trusting in His plan, and being part of His greater story? Because the truth is, even now, God is writing a bigger story than we can see. He is still working through those who seek Him, who follow Him, who trust in His promises. Seth's descendants didn't know how their story would unfold. They had no idea that one day, through their bloodline, the Messiah would come. But they walked in faith anyway. And today, we are invited to do the same. So what about you? Which legacy will you choose? Will you walk in the path of self-reliance? Or will you walk in faith, trusting that even when you don't see the full picture, God is doing something greater than you could ever imagine? If this message is stirring something in your heart, let us know in the comments. And if you're ready to dive deeper into this incredible story, stay with us. Because next, we'll explore one of the most mysterious figures in Seth's lineage, the man who walked so closely with God that he never saw death: Enoch. You won't want to miss it. Imagine a world completely transformed, silent, vast, washed clean by the greatest judgment ever seen. The waters had swallowed everything, leaving only a lonely ark resting atop the mountains of Ararat. Inside, Noah and his family stepped cautiously onto the damp earth, breathing in the crisp air of a world reborn. Everything had changed. The world before the flood had been filled with violence, corruption, and chaos, a place where people had turned their backs on God, seeking only their own desires. But now, in this moment of stillness, something new was about to begin. Noah, overwhelmed with gratitude, gathered stones and built an altar. The first thing he did was worship, offering sacrifices to the God who had spared him, his family, and the future of humanity itself. And in that moment, something incredible happened. God spoke. "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures, as I have done." Genesis 8:21. It was a promise unlike any before. The flood had been an act of both judgment and mercy. It wiped out evil, but it also preserved life. And now, standing before Noah, was the God who had just reshaped the world, and he was making a covenant, a divine agreement that would stretch across time itself. God declared, "I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." Genesis 9:11. And then he gave a sign, something visible, something tangible, something that would forever remind humanity of his faithfulness. A rainbow appeared in the sky. But why a rainbow? To us, a rainbow is simply light refracting through moisture in the air, a scientific marvel of color and beauty. But to Noah, and to all who would come after him, it meant something far greater. It was a symbol of mercy, a declaration that judgment would not be the final word, that even in humanity's failures, there would be grace. God said, "Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth." Genesis 9:16. This wasn't just a promise to Noah. It was a promise to every generation that followed. A covenant not just between God and humanity, but between God and all of creation, the birds that soared, the beasts that roamed, the creatures that filled the seas. Every living thing would be covered under this divine promise. The rainbow became a bridge between judgment and hope, between justice and mercy. Think about that for a moment. God had every right to start over, to wipe the slate clean completely. But instead, he chose grace. He chose restoration. He chose to bind himself to humanity with an unbreakable promise. And that's what makes this covenant so powerful. It tells us something profound about the heart of God. He is not a God who delights in destruction, but a God who longs for redemption. The flood had washed the earth, but the covenant of the rainbow would stand forever, as a reminder that God's ultimate desire is to save, not destroy. And this promise extends even to us today. Every time we see a rainbow, we are looking at the same sign that Noah saw thousands of years ago. It's a reminder that no matter how broken the world may seem, no matter how much darkness surrounds us, God is still faithful. And there's something else, something even deeper. The rainbow is a foreshadowing of an even greater covenant to come. Just as the flood cleansed the earth, another cleansing was on the horizon. But this time, it would not be through water. It would be through blood. A greater promise was coming. A Savior was coming. The rainbow points us to Jesus Christ, the one who would bring the final covenant, the ultimate act of mercy, the greatest sign of God's love. Through Jesus, humanity would be given a way back to God, not through judgment, but through redemption. And just like the rainbow, the cross would become a symbol of grace, a symbol of God's unbreakable promise, a symbol that justice had been satisfied and mercy had triumphed. So today, when you see a rainbow stretching across the sky, remember what it truly means. It is not just a beautiful phenomenon. It is a message from God, one that has been speaking for generations, calling us back to Him, reminding us that His love never fails. Even when the storm rages, even when the floodwaters rise, even when everything seems lost, God is faithful, and His covenant still stands. If this message speaks to your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready to dive even deeper into the mysteries of God's promises, stay with us, because next we'll explore how the story of Noah connects to the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for humanity. You won't want to miss it. Have you ever stopped to consider how the stories of the Bible, especially those from the earliest pages of Genesis, connect to your own life? They aren't just ancient tales meant to be read and forgotten. They hold deep wisdom, powerful themes, and life-changing lessons that still speak to us today. Take a moment and think about the story of Cain and Abel, the pain of jealousy, the weight of sin, the reality of consequences. These are themes that play out in our world every single day. Or the life of Noah, a man who chose faithfulness in a world that mocked him, a man who walked with God even when everything around him was crumbling. These aren't just history lessons. They're mirrors reflecting our own struggles, choices, and journeys. One of the first and most striking themes in these early biblical stories is the power of free will. God never forced Cain to sin. He warned him, told him that sin was crouching at the door, waiting to consume him, and yet Cain still chose to act on his anger, his jealousy. That same choice is set before us daily. We can allow our emotions, our desires, and our pride to control us. Or we can surrender them to God, letting Him shape our hearts. Cain's downfall wasn't just in his actions, it was in his refusal to humble himself and seek forgiveness. And that leads us to another crucial lesson: the consequences of sin and the weight of our choices. Cain didn't just lose his brother, he lost his home. He lost his peace. He became a restless wanderer, forever bearing the mark of his decision. But look at Noah. Noah's world was just as broken, maybe even more so. The Bible describes the earth in his time as being filled with violence, corruption, and wickedness. And yet Noah chose to live righteously. He chose faith when no one else did. He chose obedience when it made no sense. And because of that, he became the means by which God preserved humanity. That's another key theme: faith in action. It's not enough to believe in God. Cain believed in God. So did the people of Noah's time. But only those who put their faith into action were saved. Noah didn't just trust God. He built an ark when the skies were clear. Abel didn't just acknowledge God. He gave him his best sacrifice. And this theme plays out throughout the entire Bible. Real faith requires movement, obedience, and trust. Even when we don't understand, another lesson woven through these stories is God's justice and mercy. Cain's punishment was severe, but God still protected him. The flood wiped out a corrupt world, but God still saved a remnant. Over and over again, we see that God is both just and merciful. He does not ignore sin, but He also does not abandon His people. That should give us both reverence and hope. It should remind us that sin has consequences, but it should also give us confidence that God's grace is always available to those who seek Him. And finally, one of the most beautiful themes in these stories is redemption and second chances. Adam and Eve sinned, but God gave them Seth, a new beginning. Cain was cast out, but God still marked him for protection. The world was flooded, but Noah and his family were given the task of rebuilding. Everywhere you look in these early stories, you see the heart of God, a God who does not give up on humanity, a God who extends mercy even in the midst of judgment, a God who calls His people to something greater. So the question is, how do these themes connect to your life today? Are there areas where you've been allowing sin to grow instead of confronting it? Are there choices you've made that have left you wandering, restless, and distant from God? Or maybe you're in a season where God is calling you to build something, to step out in faith even when it doesn't make sense. Wherever you are in your journey, these stories offer guidance, warning, encouragement, and hope. They remind us that we are not the first to struggle with sin. We are not the first to wrestle with doubt. We are not the first to be called into something greater. And most importantly, they remind us that God is still writing the story. How will you respond? If these reflections are stirring something in your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to continue exploring the deep truths of the Bible, stay with us. In the next part, we'll dive into how the legacy of these early figures shaped the world, and how their stories still shape us today. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in Cain's shoes. You've just made a decision, an irreversible one, that has changed everything. Your world has been shattered, your relationships broken, and now you're facing the weight of your choices. The road ahead is uncertain, and the past is heavy on your shoulders. Now, consider Noah. The world around him is collapsing into chaos, filled with corruption and evil. Yet, in the midst of it all, he remains steadfast. He holds on to something greater than himself, his faith. And because of that, he becomes the vessel through which humanity gets another chance. These aren't just ancient stories, they are reflections of the choices we face every single day. The struggles, the temptations, the need for faith, the weight of consequences. Nothing has changed. The lessons from Genesis are just as relevant now as they were thousands of years ago. So how do we apply these stories to our lives today? Let's start with Cain's story, the story of jealousy, anger, and unchecked sin. How many times have we let bitterness take root in our hearts? Maybe it's in our families, with a sibling, a parent, or a child. Maybe it's at work, with a coworker who always seems to get ahead. Maybe it's in our friendships, where old wounds have festered and turned into resentment. Cain's biggest mistake wasn't just the act of violence, it was what led up to it. He had a choice when he felt jealousy toward Abel. He had a moment where he could have humbled himself before God and sought a different path. Instead, he allowed sin to grow. He let his anger fester, and it consumed him. The lesson here is simple. Unchecked bitterness leads to destruction. Ephesians 4:31 warns us to get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger. Because if we don't, they will control us, just like they controlled Cain. Now, what about Noah's story? Noah was surrounded by corruption. He lived in a world that had turned away from God. People mocked righteousness. They rejected truth. Does that sound familiar? We live in a culture that often values self over sacrifice, pride over humility, pleasure over purpose. We are surrounded by voices telling us that following God is outdated, unnecessary, or even foolish. And yet, Noah didn't conform. He obeyed, even when it didn't make sense. He built the ark when the skies were clear. He followed God's command even when it seemed ridiculous to those around him. And because of that, he became the bridge between a broken past and a new future. Noah's lesson for us? Faith requires obedience, even when it doesn't make sense. Hebrews 11:7 tells us that by faith, Noah became an heir of righteousness. His story challenges us to examine our own faith. Are we living it out? Are we trusting God even when it's difficult? Or are we waiting for the rain before we start building the ark? And then there's the legacy of Seth. When Adam and Eve lost Abel and saw Cain cast out, they must have felt hopeless. But then came Seth, a sign that God was not finished. Through Seth's line, people began to call on the name of the Lord. His story reminds us of an important truth. God always provides a new beginning. Maybe you've made mistakes. Maybe you've wandered far from where you were meant to be. Maybe you feel like the damage has been done and there's no way back. But God always makes a way. Just as he brought Seth after Cain's failure, just as he gave Noah a fresh start, he offers us redemption. Romans 8:28 reminds us that God works all things for the good of those who love him. That means no failure is final. No past mistake is beyond redemption. So, how do we take all of these lessons and apply them today? We let go of bitterness before it destroys us. We choose faith, even when it's hard. We trust that God's plan includes restoration, no matter how broken things seem. But there's one more thing. We have to share these truths. The world today needs people like Noah, people willing to stand firm in faith when everything around them is falling apart. It needs people who will choose righteousness over revenge, humility over pride, forgiveness over bitterness. It needs people who won't just believe in God, but who will live out their faith boldly. So the question is, are you willing to be one of them? Are you willing to build the ark before the rain comes? Are you willing to trust that God is still writing your story? If this message is speaking to your heart, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready to go deeper into these biblical lessons, stay with us. The next part will challenge you to walk boldly in faith, no matter what obstacles stand in your way. Take a moment and picture this. You're standing at the edge of a vast landscape, looking back at the path you've traveled. Some parts of the journey were smooth, others were filled with obstacles. At times you walked in light, confident in your steps. At other times you stumbled in the darkness, unsure of the way forward. That's the nature of life, and that's the nature of faith. When we look at the stories of Cain, Seth, and Noah, we see more than just ancient events. We see the same struggles that play out in our own hearts and lives today. Choices, consequences, redemption, and faith, they are woven into the very fabric of our existence. Cain's story reminds us of the devastating power of unchecked sin. His jealousy, his anger, and his unwillingness to confront his own heart led him down a path of destruction. We see echoes of that same struggle today, in the bitterness that festers within us, in the grudges we refuse to let go of, in the temptations that call us toward paths we know we shouldn't take. Cain's fall is a warning. Sin, when left to grow, will consume us. And then there's Seth, the quiet yet powerful reminder that God is always writing a greater story. Even when hope seems lost, even when it feels like everything has fallen apart, God brings restoration. Through Seth, a new line was established, a new beginning. His story whispers to us that no matter what has happened in our past, we are never beyond God's ability to redeem and restore. And then there's Noah, the man who dared to believe in the unseen, who trusted God when the rest of the world mocked him. His obedience wasn't based on what was easy or logical, it was built on faith. He listened, he followed, and because of that, he became the bridge between destruction and renewal. So here we are, thousands of years later, standing in the same position as these men. Every day we are faced with choices. Will we let sin control us like Cain, or will we seek a new beginning like Seth? Will we trust God in the unknown like Noah, or will we shrink back when faith requires action? The truth is, we all have moments where we fail, where we struggle, where we feel lost. But the lesson that rings through all of these stories is this: God is always present, always working, always calling us towards something greater. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever faced a moment where jealousy or resentment took hold of your heart? Did it lead to peace, or did it create more hurt? Have you ever walked through a season where everything felt broken, where you wondered if God had abandoned you? And then, out of nowhere, a new beginning emerged. Have you ever stood at a crossroads, where faith required you to take a step into the unknown, even when everything in you wanted to hold back? These moments define us, and in each of them, God is extending his hand, offering us a choice. Cain's story tells us what happens when we reject that hand. Seth's story tells us that God is always willing to restore. Noah's story tells us that when we trust him, we step into a plan that is far greater than we can see. So, what do we do with all of this? First, we examine our hearts. We look at the areas where sin has taken root, and we surrender them to God. Second, we embrace redemption. We recognize that our past does not define us, and that God is in the business of making all things new. Third, we walk forward in faith. We take steps of obedience, even when it doesn't make sense, trusting that God's plan is always greater than our understanding. And finally, we share this truth with others. The world is filled with people who are trapped in the same struggles as Cain, who are longing for the renewal of Seth, who need the unwavering faith of Noah. When we live out these truths, we become the light that points them toward hope. Maybe today is your moment to step into something new. Maybe there's a choice in front of you that requires faith. Maybe there's a burden you need to release, a fresh start you need to embrace, a calling you need to answer. Whatever it is, know this: God is already ahead of you, preparing the way. All you have to do is trust Him. If this message has spoken to your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready to continue on this journey of faith, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because there is so much more to uncover in the Word of God. Thank you for being here. Let's walk forward together, in faith, in hope, and in trust. Knowing that God's story is still being written, imagine standing at a crossroads where one path leads to destruction, another to redemption, and a third to unwavering faith. This is not just the story of Cain, Seth, and Noah. It is the story of every believer. Their lives reflect choices that echo through time, carrying lessons that are just as relevant today as they were in the earliest days of human history. Cain teaches us about the dangers of unchecked sin. Seth reminds us that God always provides a path of restoration, and Noah shows us the power of obedience and faith in the face of the unknown. For Catholics, these stories are more than just ancient narratives. They are lessons that shape our spiritual walk. They challenge us to examine our hearts, embrace God's mercy, and trust in His divine plan. As we explore these lessons, reflect on how they apply to your own life. Where do you see yourself in these stories? What choices are before you right now? Here are 5 key lessons inspired by the journey of Cain, Seth, and Noah. Lessons that can deepen our faith and help us walk more closely with God. Lesson 1: the destructive power of sin and the need for repentance. Cain's story is a sobering reminder of how sin, when left unchecked, can consume us. Jealousy led him to resentment. Resentment turned into anger, and anger culminated in an irreversible act, taking his brother's life. As Catholics, we are called to recognize sin in its early stages before it hardens our hearts. The sacrament of reconciliation offers us a way to break free from the grip of sin. In 1 John 1:9 we are assured, "If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." Cain failed to repent when confronted by God, but we have the opportunity to turn back before sin leads us further away. When was the last time you truly examined your heart and sought God's forgiveness? Let Cain's story be a warning. Sin grows when left unaddressed, but grace abounds when we choose to return to God. Lesson 2: God always offers a path to redemption. Seth's birth is more than just another child being born. It is a symbol of God's enduring mercy. Even after the tragedy of Cain's actions, God provided Adam and Eve with a new lineage, one that would restore faithfulness and call upon His name. This reminds us that no matter how broken our past may be, God always extends an opportunity for renewal. Isaiah 43:19 declares, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it?" Through the grace of Christ, we are never beyond redemption. In moments when you feel like your past defines you, remember that God is always at work, offering new beginnings just as He did with Seth's lineage. Are you willing to step into that new chapter, trusting that God's mercy is greater than your mistakes? Lesson 3: walking in obedience, even when it doesn't make sense. Noah's obedience to God is one of the most remarkable examples of faith in Scripture. He built an ark in a time when rain had never fallen, trusting in something unseen. He endured ridicule and doubt, yet he remained faithful to God's instructions. This calls us to reflect on our own obedience. Are we willing to trust God, even when His plans don't align with our expectations? In the Catholic faith, we are often called to embrace teachings that go against the ways of the world. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Are there areas in your life where God is calling you to trust Him, even when the outcome is unclear? Noah's story teaches us that obedience leads to blessings, even when the journey is difficult. Lesson 4. The symbol of the rainbow, God's faithfulness in every season. After the flood, God placed a rainbow in the sky as a covenant, a promise that He would never again destroy the earth by water. This was more than just a beautiful sign. It was a declaration of His faithfulness. In our own lives, we face storms, loss, uncertainty, trials. But God's covenant with Noah reminds us that He is always with us, guiding us through every challenge. Lamentations 3:22-23 says, "Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." When we look at the trials in our lives, do we focus only on the storm, or do we search for the rainbow, the sign that God's faithfulness is ever present? Noah teaches us that even after devastation, God brings restoration. What storm in your life needs to be met with faith in His promises? Lesson 5. Our choices leave a lasting legacy. Cain's lineage was marked by violence and self-reliance. Seth's lineage was marked by faithfulness and devotion to God. The contrast between the two reminds us that the choices we make today impact future generations. As Catholics, we are called to leave a legacy of faith, not just in words, but in actions. Deuteronomy 6:6-7 instructs, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up." Are we passing down a legacy of faith to those around us? Are we living in a way that reflects God's love and truth? Seth's line led to Noah, and from Noah came the continuation of God's plan. Likewise, our lives have a purpose beyond what we can see. How we live today shapes the future of our families, our communities, and even generations to come. The stories of Cain, Seth, and Noah are not just history, they are blueprints for our own spiritual journeys. Will we allow sin to take root in our hearts, or will we repent before it leads us astray? Will we trust in God's ability to redeem and restore, or will we dwell on the failures of our past? Will we walk in obedience like Noah, even when the path is unclear? Will we hold on to God's promises, even when the storms come? And will we leave a legacy of faith that extends beyond our own lives? These are the questions that challenge us as believers. These are the choices that define our walk with Christ. As you reflect on these lessons, take a moment to pray. Ask God to reveal the areas where He is calling you to grow, to trust, and to step forward in faith. And if this message has resonated with you, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Let's walk together in faith, trusting that God's plan is always greater and His promises never fail. Amen.